A quiet beginning. Emily Turner's day began like any other, drenched in the soft golden glow of the early morning sun that poured through her modest kitchen window. The sleepy suburb of Maplewood, nestled on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, was just starting to come alive. The familiar chorus of school buses, chirping birds, and distant lawnmowers blended into a comforting symphony that Emily had come to cherish. Emily, 32 and single by choice, was not a woman easily rattled by the monotony of routine. To her, being an English teacher at Maplewood High wasn't just a profession. It was a calling born from an unwavering belief in the power of words to shape hearts and futures. Her classroom was often filled with posters of famous authors, handwritten motivational quotes, and more than a few worn copies of American classics, gifted to eager students over the years. She loved the soft hum of adolescent chatter in the hallway, and the moments right before class began when students filed into room 202, a space many considered a safe haven. Emily's teaching style was rigorous yet caring. She challenged her students to think critically, to question what they read, and even, at times, to question her. Her strict grading and expectation of discipline were balanced by an open-door policy. Students knew they could come to her with problems that had nothing to do with literature. In spite of her students' respect and genuine affection, Emily's relationship with the school administration was far less comfortable. Principal John Adams, a man known for his old-school sensibilities and close-knit relationships with Maplewood's prominent families, regarded Emily as an outsider. She sometimes felt the subtle distance between herself and the core faculty, a handful of whom had been teaching at Maplewood for decades. In meetings, her innovative suggestions for curriculum updates or student welfare programs were often sidestepped or gently dismissed. But Emily had grown used to swimming against the tide. She found solace in her friendships with a few like-minded teachers, such as Ms. Parker from the science department, and in the letters and emails from former students who credited her with changing the course of their lives. Beneath the surface, however, not all was as idyllic as it seemed. Over PTO coffee breaks and at weekend soccer games, the school's more influential parents, Mrs. Lori Miller at the forefront, sometimes whispered their discontent. They preferred educators who kept their heads down and readily accommodated parental preferences, including those that blurred ethical lines about discipline or grades. Emily's refusal to inflate test scores or make exceptions for certain students' misbehavior had, over the years, quietly earned her a small but powerful coterie of detractors. On this particular September morning, as Emily sipped her coffee and assembled lesson plans, she had no reason to suspect that the year ahead would test her in ways she'd never imagined. In her mind, the challenges she might face would come in the form of another ambitious literature curriculum, or perhaps yet another plea from the administration to tone down her expectations for students whose parents just wanted them to feel successful. The undercurrents of Maplewood's politics had yet to rise to the surface. For now, Emily carried her books and ideals into the school building, determined to make a difference, unaware of the storm brewing quietly on the horizon. Undercurrents. The school year moved into full swing as September deepened, bringing with it new faces, packed hallways, and the energetic uncertainty of a fresh academic term. But for Emily Turner, there was a subtle shift in the air, something faint yet undeniable, like the distant rumble of thunder on a seemingly bright day. It began quietly. Whispers flitted through the teacher's lounge, lingering just beyond earshot whenever Emily entered the room. Colleagues with whom she'd once shared laughter and lesson plan ideas now seemed preoccupied with their phones or hurried conversations when she approached. The once friendly smiles grew tight. Invitations to staff lunches or weekend gatherings, never abundant, evaporated altogether. At first, Emily shrugged it off, attributing the tension to early semester stress. But small things piled up. The copier would jam mysteriously when she needed it, with no assistance offered. Her mailbox became suspiciously empty of all but official memos, while other teachers exchanged inside jokes and thoughtful notes. During staff meetings, when Emily raised her hand to offer suggestions, Principal Adams rarely called on her, his eyes sliding past as if she'd become part of the furniture. Among students, too, ripples of something darker became noticeable. A handful of juniors, typically her strongest supporters, began to seem distant or wary. Quiet snickers echoed after she passed in the hallway. One afternoon, Emily discovered a crude caricature of herself taped to her classroom door. "Ms. Turner, Queen of Detentions." She brushed it off, but the laughter from down the corridor stung. The source soon became impossible to ignore. One Friday, Emily overheard two students talking in the back of her classroom before the bell. Over the weekend, rumors reached her through a trusted colleague. Parents were posting in community Facebook groups alleging Emily was unfair, has it out for certain students, and was unprofessional, especially with parents. Mrs. Lori Miller's name popped up more than once as the thread starter, each post feeding the fire of speculation. Determined to remain unshaken, Emily redoubled her efforts with her students, offering extra help after school, reaching out to parents, and clarifying her grading policies. But the damage was done. She sensed an invisible wall climbing steadily higher. Students grew quiet around her, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering during class. A few parents, previously warm at pickup, now offered terse nods or avoided her gaze altogether. As the weeks wore on, the subtle torment left Emily feeling like a stranger in her own workplace. Even her closest allies grew distant, stopped short by fear of guilt by association. While she maintained professionalism and unwavering support for her students, a chill had settled in her heart, a fragile, persistent ache she couldn't quite fix. And through it all, she wondered, who was behind these rumors? Who was so determined to see her isolated? Where and how had things gone so wrong? In the soft, fading daylight of late September, as Emily locked up room 202 and glanced over the empty hallways, she realized that beneath Maplewood High's polished surface, cracks of distrust and resentment were spreading wide. The storm hadn't broken yet, but its warning winds were howling all around her. The first blow, the first crisp Monday in October, dawned unremarkable. Yet Emily sensed something off as she walked through Maplewood High's front doors. Hallway greetings were more muted than usual. Averted eyes and hushed exchanges seemed to follow her down the corridor, a silent current just below the surface. She made her way to her classroom, hoping it was simply her imagination, but soon realized the day would be anything but ordinary. The official summons arrived just after second period, a terse email from Principal Adams. Inside the sterile, sunlit confines of the main office, Emily found not only Principal Adams behind his imposing desk, but also Miss Garcia, the district's human resources representative, her expression carefully neutral. A thick manila folder sat between them, brimming with printed emails, screenshots, and a formally worded letter. An anonymous parental complaint had grown into something much larger. Principal Adams got straight to the point. "Emily, I regret to inform you that the school has received a serious formal complaint regarding your conduct as an educator." When she looked up, Miss Garcia's face betrayed a flash of sympathy before she too defaulted to procedure. "We take these matters very seriously, Ms. Turner. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Please turn in your keys and refrain from contacting students or their families except through official channels." The verdict felt surreal. Emily tried to defend herself, to protest. "None of this is true. Someone is trying to—" As she packed her personal belongings into a cardboard box, under the watchful eye of an office aide, Emily's mind raced. The anonymity and organization of the attack were chilling. She caught snippets of hallway conversation, teachers whispering, office staff exchanging worried glances. All signs pointed to something orchestrated from above, not merely disgruntled parents complaining about tough grading. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, Emily combed through social media and the Parent-Teacher Association's Facebook group. It didn't take long to spot public threads dripping with speculation, all circling the same themes as her official accusation. Post after post, Mrs. Lori Miller, a well-connected parent whose son Emily had disciplined weeks earlier, seemed to be at the epicenter, rallying others and framing Emily as an unfit teacher, a danger to our children. Unable to sleep, Emily replayed every moment from the past few weeks, tracing the rising tide of rumors and whispers. Now, the campaign had a face and a name, and she had been swiftly removed from the job she loved, her integrity left teetering on the edge. The realization was both devastating and galvanizing. For now, no one called. Her phone stayed silent, except for a few cautious texts from her closest allies, expressing sorrow but offering little comfort. The machinery of the district investigation was rolling, cold, impersonal, and indifferent to truth. As the hours wore on, her initial shock hardened. Beneath the ache of betrayal, a quiet determination stirred. If this was indeed the first blow, Emily resolved, she would not be an easy victim. In the gathering dusk, she sat in the pale blue light of her desk lamp, surrounded by the fragments of the life that had just been torn away, and vowed to find out who was orchestrating her downfall and why. Isolation and doubt. For Emily Turner, life had always revolved around the rhythms of Maplewood High, lesson plans and laughter, hallway banter, the gleam in a student's eye when a new idea finally clicked. Now, the comforting cadence of her days had vanished, replaced by a hollow ache and the persistent silence of exile. Her last morning in the classroom replayed in Emily's mind with unsettling clarity. Her hands shaking as she packed her battered mug, stacks of graded essays, one faded photograph of a grinning class. The walls of room 202, once lined with colorful author portraits and student projects, had never looked so bare. Gone, too, was the busy current of adolescent energy. All that remained was the memory of hurried footsteps and the soft thud of the closing door as she left her keys with the office aide. In the first hours after her suspension, Emily wandered her apartment in a kind of slow-motion daze. Her phone buzzed with notifications, a constant stream of district emails, most coldly worded and procedural. A handful of colleagues offered brief messages of support, always tinged with anxiety. Her mother, states away in Ohio, left a voicemail. "You're strong, honey. Don't let these people get to you." Even so, Emily couldn't quite bring herself to call back and admit just how frightened and adrift she'd become. The local news, meanwhile, offered its own silent commentary. She caught her own name in a scrolling headline on a community Facebook group. In the days that followed, the sense of betrayal gnawed at her. She replayed every recent interaction. Was it the time she'd held a student after class to check on a missing assignment? The moment she intervened in a hallway scuffle? Did a stern look or poorly chosen phrase ignite all this? The more she searched her memory, the more the days blurred together into a fog of self-doubt. Emily stopped opening social media. Each notification promised fresh wounds, more rumors, more questions. Even neighbors she'd known for years adopted a wary distance. Conversations that once lingered over weather and weekend plans now dried up awkwardly the moment the topic of school arose. She made herself get out of bed, shower, eat. Basic acts of self-care that now felt like small triumphs. The city outside moved on without her. Children still walked to school in groups, Parents still hurried past her window with coffee and laptops in hand. She watched them from her apartment, feeling both invisible and hypervisible, certain that every whisper in the grocery store or coffee shop was about her. One afternoon, as gray drizzle streaked the panes, Emily gathered the courage to walk downtown to the park. Maplewood's autumn leaves created a riot of orange and gold along the paths. She sat on a bench, pulling her coat tighter, struggling to remember how to breathe deeply. Two students jogged by, glancing her way with uncertain eyes. One of them waved, hesitant. Emily attempted a smile, unsure if it reached her eyes. That evening, Emily began to journal, a habit she'd let slide in recent years. The exercise felt fragile at first, words stuttering across the page. Sleep came in fits and starts, punctuated by anxious dreams, classrooms filled with faceless students, doors that closed and locked from the outside. Voices she recognized but couldn't name. She woke with her jaw clenched, sheets tangled around her legs, mind replaying the accusations. Was there something she'd missed? Something she could have done differently? The mail became a daily gauntlet. Official envelopes from the school district, all stamped confidential. The language inside was clinical, almost sterile, detailing investigation procedures and prohibiting contact with students, parents, or staff. The district's support extended only as far as a packet of brochures for legal counsel and the phone number for an employee assistance program. Isolation deepened. Even her apartment, usually a refuge, became a maze of anxious thoughts. A cluttered kitchen where she brewed endless cups of tea she barely touched. A living room where the television flickered day and night, companion to her restlessness. Her books, once a comfort, now seemed to taunt her with stories of perseverance and triumph that felt unreachable. But it wasn't all despair. As days turned into a week, a quiet determination started to take root. Emily realized she could not simply wait, passive and powerless, for the investigation to run its course. She began to really question, what had led to her sudden ousting. If the complaint was more organized than it appeared, then perhaps there were motives and connections to uncover. She let herself remember the little oddities from before. The way Principal Adams always deferred to certain parent requests. How Lori Miller seemed to know more about administrative decisions than most of the staff. The pattern of students mysteriously moved from her class after disciplinary incidents involving important families. She recalled snippets of overheard gossip, words that at the time had seemed inconsequential. Emily summoned the courage to reach out. Carefully, she emailed 2 former students who'd long since graduated, framing her message as a check-in, searching for any insight into recent rumors. She texted the science teacher, Ms. Parker, hoping to find a shred of genuine support. "Hang in there," Ms. Parker replied, after days of silence. "You know who you are. Don't let them erase that. Things are tense at school, but some of us are watching. We haven't forgotten what you've done for your students." That message brought Emily to tears, not simply for the words themselves, but because they broke the relentless solitude of her days. Late one night, unable to sleep, Emily sat at her computer, rereading the formal complaint again and again. She created a spreadsheet, recording the dates of parent-teacher meetings, every disciplinary action she'd taken, every communication in the last month. A pattern began to emerge. The same names cropped up, the same circles of influence, the same handful of families whose children seemed always untouched by consequence. A steely focus replaced her initial desolation. If the truth was buried here, Emily meant to find it, starting with the events that led to her suspension and the network of silent deals and unspoken favoritism that had flourished behind official doors. She was still afraid and still very much alone. But as another gray morning dawned, Emily felt, for the first time since she left room 202, a sense of clarity pierced the fog. Betrayed and isolated, yes, but not defeated, not by a long shot. Investigation and counterattack. The days after Emily's realization passed in a blur of worry, resolve, and methodical activity. Her isolation, though still acute, had begun to morph into a sense of purpose. She understood now that being passive would only deepen her defeat. Action was her only remaining shield. Emily dove headlong into the unfamiliar roles of investigator, advocate, and, if need be, whistleblower. Her first step was information gathering. She combed back through her digital and physical records, every email, grade report, parent correspondence, disciplinary form, and faculty meeting agenda. She approached it like a scholar researching a complicated novel, hunting for connections that others had overlooked. Soon, patterns began to emerge. She noticed that particular students, those with ties to Lori Miller and a select group of influential Maplewood parents, had benefited from administrative leniency after disciplinary issues, while others faced the full brunt of the school's policies. Emily's heart hammered the first time she mapped this out. Columns of student names, dates of infractions, the corresponding emails from Principal Adams, and the subtle, consistent downgrading of consequences when a certain last name popped up. She saved everything meticulously to a password-protected folder and took care to back up her work to an encrypted cloud service, fearful of her accounts being accessed. She was learning, with grim clarity, how vulnerable she'd been to manipulation all along. Knowing she couldn't do this alone, Emily reached out, carefully, always using secure, private channels. She confided in Miss Parker, the science teacher who had sent her a lifeline of encouragement. Parker, burdened but unafraid, offered more than comfort. She quietly forwarded Emily a trove of internal memos, some of which bore Principal Adams' cryptic handwritten notes. Handle gently, Lori M. upset, and discuss transfer with LM. Each new document painted the picture in sharper relief. Beyond staff, Emily found support in a few former students who had since graduated. Michael, now a college freshman, remembered how Mrs. Miller had lobbied for his removal from Emily's class after he'd challenged her son during a debate. Rachel emailed, "I always wondered why my A on your final got changed to a B. Principal said clerical error, but now I'm not so sure." These stories, when placed beside Emily's records, rebuilt the narrative she suspected but had never been able to prove. As her documentary arsenal thickened, so did her resolve to move beyond defense and over to counterattack. Emily's research pointed to a deeper relationship between Lori Miller and Principal Adams, one that went beyond the standard parent-administrator interactions. She ran background searches, scouring public donation records, property databases, and school fundraising bulletins. Sure enough, she found that the Miller family's business had provided generous, targeted donations to the district, most prominently for Maplewood Excellence initiatives spearheaded by Adams. Some were legitimate, but others raised questions. Why did only the classrooms of select teachers receive new computers, and why did the Miller children always seem to benefit from new pilot programs? Emily kept notes on everything, cross-checking her findings with public data. One evening, as rain hammered outside her window, she stumbled across a major lead. A new administrative assistant, hired just before the complaint against her, was a distant relative of Lori Miller, her niece, to be precise. The assistant's references were scant, and her interviews had been conducted by Principal Adams in private, bypassing customary hiring protocol. Emily realized she was unearthing a network, not just a pair of complicit actors. Her next step was evidence collection. Emily knew firsthand how rumors could gain traction with only half a story. Any accusation she made would need to be ironclad, not circumstantial. She began to record calls, after confirming the legality in her state, and took screenshots of every online slander about herself, especially those shared or liked by Lori Miller. She signed up for social media alerts to monitor new posts in the community Facebook group and joined a parent forum under a pseudonym where she observed Miller and several others actively crafting a narrative against her, complete with suggested talking points for concerned parents to email the district. but it was an accidental discovery that clinched her case. While scanning through months-old emails, she found a forwarded message not meant for her eyes. It clearly showed Principal Adams advising Miller how to word official complaints for maximum effect, listing school policy language to reference for seriousness and actionability. The email was damning, not only because of its content, but also because of its timing. It was sent a week before the first wave of negative posts about Emily had appeared online. With a bolstered dossier, Emily began to consider her options. She knew that quietly submitting her evidence to the district might result in a slow, quietly buried internal review, most likely overseen by the very people she now suspected. Instead, she decided to broaden her strategy and make noise. First, she crafted an anonymous tip for the local newspaper, including redacted screenshots and a timeline of events. She also contacted a respected education advocacy group known for protecting whistleblowers and fighting administrative corruption. Their lawyer called her that same afternoon, offering advice, moral support, and a way to deliver her files without fear of sabotage or deletion. Meanwhile, Emily designed a careful social media campaign to defend her integrity and expose the roots of her situation. She started by sharing, on her private Facebook, a long, heartfelt letter addressed to my community. In it, she recounted her love for teaching, her record of student advocacy, her ethical stand in the classroom, and, without naming names, her suspicion that systemic favoritism and unethical interference were damaging Maplewood's values. The post went semi-viral almost immediately, the comments section filling with heartfelt testimonials from former students, supportive parents, and a handful of brave faculty. Encouraged, she followed up with a second post, this time sharing polished, depersonalized samples of her evidence, redacted emails demonstrating inappropriate collaboration between parent and principal, screenshots of manipulative online organizing, and a brief but pointed chart showing disciplinary inequities. She didn't accuse, but in her measured tone made it clear that the truth would come out, and that silence in the face of injustice was not an option. What surprised her most was the groundswell of support. Private messages from colleagues who had feared retaliation, parents confessing they'd long suspected favoritism, and even a board member's spouse asking cautiously for more information. Michael and Rachel started a Stand with Ms. Turner hashtag, which gained traction throughout the school and even the broader Portland education community. By the end of the week, Emily was no longer alone. The air around Maplewood was charged and unsettled, but it was no longer filled solely with whispers against her. The story was spreading, and with her arsenal of proof, Emily was ready, at last, to force the cracks in Maplewood's polished surface wide open. The evidence emerges. In the days that followed Emily's public stand, the slow unraveling of Maplewood's long-hidden secrets gained momentum. What had once been a web of whispers and deflected suspicion now began slipping into the open light, thread by thread. Emily's evidence, meticulously gathered and methodically organized, became a living map of the favoritism and corruption that had simmered at the heart of the school. She hadn't expected instant change. Her experiences had taught her just how deeply entrenched power could be, and how skillfully it defended itself. Yet as the evidence began to circulate, the atmosphere in Maplewood shifted, and for the first time since her suspension, Emily felt hope flicker to life. One of Emily's earliest moves was to send her complete dossier to the independent education advocacy group that had reached out to her. Their lead investigator, Miss Klein, was relentless. A former teacher herself, unwilling to allow injustice to settle into routine. Together, Emily and Miss Klein pored over the files, adding corroboration from several frightened but resolute witnesses. Ms. Parker, steadfast as ever, agreed to provide a confidential statement about the manipulation she'd observed in the staff room. A few parents, emboldened by Emily's public posts, also stepped forward, sharing stories about pressure put on them by Lori Miller and a small clique of influential families. The compiled evidence was damning in both its breadth and its pattern. There were blurred phone photos of hastily changed gradebooks, emails in which Principal Adams asked a teacher to just consider the stress on the Miller family this semester after a disciplinary incident. Chillingly, one screen-captured group chat among parents discussed neutralizing Emily Turner's influence and listed steps for documenting student complaints, even suggesting which policy violations would be most damaging. All of it was cross-referenced with school policies, administrative actions, and dates of Emily's own supposed infractions. The advocacy group, well-versed in institutional evasion, prepared a comprehensive report and presented it directly to the school board's ethics committee. The timing could not have been more critical. Local media, spurred by the anonymous tip and then a trickle of insider leaks, began reporting not just on Emily's case, but on the larger question of fairness in the school system. The question on parents' lips shifted from, "What did Ms. Turner do?" to, "What is happening at Maplewood High?" As the board convened in a closed-door emergency session, Emily watched anxiously from her apartment, phone in hand, heart hammering. She spent long hours revisiting her notes, supplementing them with fresh details as supporters came forward. An older custodian who had worked at the school for decades quietly emailed to confirm that the administrative assistant, Lori Miller's niece, was hired through a process no one else even knew about. Another teacher admitted to being pressured to revise a student's conduct report after a concerned parent complained and threatened to pull school donations. Bit by bit, the pattern grew impossible to ignore. Even the most reluctant or skeptical members of the school board had to admit that something systematic had occurred. The board chairwoman, Dr. Evelyn Stern, issued a rare public statement. "We are committed to upholding both the integrity of this institution and the rights of every educator. This is no longer about one teacher, but about our standards as a community." Meanwhile, Emily herself continued to push forward. No longer content to sit quietly waiting for the board's judgment, she took careful steps to ensure the story could not be silenced. In addition to her existing social media advocacy, she agreed to a recorded interview with the local education beat reporter. With the protection granted by her legal advocate, she spoke openly, though carefully, about her experiences. She described the joy and burden of teaching, her commitment to every student, and the shock of discovering how easily years of integrity could be threatened by a targeted campaign. Emily's courage sparked a further groundswell. Within a week, multiple alumni wrote public letters vouching for her ethics and teaching ability. Some, having experienced the consequences of challenging untouchable students themselves, shared their stories with local reporters. The hashtag Stand With Ms. Turner movement that had first appeared online now grew into letter-writing campaigns and peaceful demonstrations outside the district office. Banners appeared downtown and at the school bus pickup. "Let truth shine at Maplewood. Justice for Ms. Turner." Perhaps most powerful was the emergence of the silent majority, those who had watched, from the sidelines, as the few wielded outsized influence. One by one, parents who had been cowed or confused by Maplewood's internal politics found the confidence to tell their stories, even if only under the shield of confidentiality. The strength of their collective voices forced the conversation away from gossip and into fact. During the official investigation, the newly assembled independent committee requested interviews with dozens of teachers, parents, and even older students. The difference in tone was striking. Instead of the whispered anxiety that had shrouded the school weeks before, Emily now saw hesitant hope and community resolve. The lines at the door of the board office were long. Records for the meeting, made available under public request, showed more than 70 statements provided in support of a thorough inquiry. For her part, Emily was methodical and fearless. She walked into the interview room bearing printed timelines, annotated screenshots, policy binders festooned with sticky notes. She answered every question with poise, refusing to fall into bitterness or conjecture. When asked about her motivations, she replied, "I am standing up not only for myself, but for every teacher whose work depends on trust, and for every student whose future depends on fairness and honesty." The response from the implicated parties was predictably defensive. Principal Adams, confronted with the collusion evidence, denied any wrongdoing, insisting the emails were misunderstood or taken out of context. Lori Miller hired a lawyer and warned that the school was singling out vocal parents. But the mass of digital trails, contradicting data, and corroborating testimony was too vast to simply talk away. Quietly, more faculty distanced themselves from the former power brokers. By week's end, the local newspaper ran the headline, "Pattern of Favoritism at Maplewood High Uncovered. Whistleblowers' Evidence Scrutinized by Board." Emily felt a weight lift, replaced by anxious hope. The battle was not yet over, but the balance of power had shifted. On a bright, chilly morning in November, Emily took her familiar walk through Maplewood streets, the autumn leaves crisp underfoot. For the first time in months, a parent she recognized from carpool waved with a real smile. Further on, a group of students offered a shy greeting, fervent support shining in their eyes. Emily knew that vindication, if it came, would be hard-won, and that no answer could ever erase the pain entirely. Even so, the emergence of truth was its own form of healing. In her quiet apartment that night, Emily read through messages from strangers thanking her for her integrity and persistence. The cracks that had once threatened to swallow her now let in the sun. For Maplewood High, and for herself, the future, at last, seemed bright with possibility. The decisive blow. By late November, the air around Maplewood High was thick with anticipation and tension. What had started as whispers and sly glances had swelled into a full-blown reckoning. Emily Turner, once relegated to the shadows of rumor and isolation, was now at the epicenter of a movement that had gathered an unstoppable momentum. The evidence had been laid bare. The community had begun to awaken. But the final, decisive blow, the moment that would force true accountability, had not yet arrived. Emily knew that if she stepped back now, the entrenched patterns of silence and protection could easily resurface. Her steadfast belief in transparency and justice pushed her to adopt a public strategy, one that would not only defend her reputation, but ensure systemic change. She began by crafting a meticulous public statement and posting it to her Facebook page, which by now had become a local nexus for discussion and support. In her letter, she wrote candidly about everything she had endured: the pain of being ostracized, the overwhelming self-doubt, and the nights spent piecing together clues. But she also spoke clearly about her love of teaching and her unwavering commitment to every student, especially those who don't come from powerful families. She avoided personal attacks, focusing instead on the broader culture of favoritism and intimidation that had festered unchecked. Her statement ended with a call to action. The post spread rapidly. Within hours, dozens of former students, sympathetic parents, and even educators from across the district had commented or shared their own stories. Emily's story had struck a nerve, not as an isolated incident, but as the visible tip of a deeply rooted problem. Simultaneously, Emily reached out to a respected local reporter, someone she had read for years and trusted to treat the story with nuance and care. Their meeting took place in a quiet corner of a downtown coffee shop. Emily came prepared: laptop, file folders, a USB drive containing redacted copies of the most damning evidence. She spoke with measured passion, never venturing beyond what she could document. The reporter listened carefully, asking probing questions, taking careful notes, and promising to get her side of the story in print. A week later, the feature landed on the front page of the Sunday paper. The story was picked up by Portland Television News, and within a day, hashtags like hashtag Justice for Emily Turner and hashtag Fix Maplewood trended locally. Students organized a peaceful rally in front of the school. Banners unfurled reading, "Fairness for all," "Truth for teachers," and simply, "We see you." Dozens of parents signed an open letter demanding an end to backroom deals and demanding a truly independent investigation. Meanwhile, inside the school, a quiet revolution was underway. No longer afraid to speak openly, teachers began supporting each other in ways both large and small. Lunchroom conversations turned toward policy proposals instead of gossip. One teacher, inspired by Emily's courage, submitted a formal request for a review of the school's disciplinary records, an action almost unheard of in the school's history. A group of concerned parents formed a new advocacy committee, unaligned with any particular clique or family. Their very first meeting overflowed the Maplewood Community Center. They read aloud names of students whose achievements had been unfairly discounted, led workshops on students' rights and equity in education, and vowed to hold the administration accountable. The crescendo arrived at the next district school board meeting. The auditorium was packed, television cameras in the back, every seat filled, and many left standing in the aisles. After a brief statement about procedure, the board opened the floor for comments. Emily stood, her heart pounding in her chest, and walked to the microphone. In her calm, unwavering voice, she addressed the room. She laid out, step by step, the pressures to overlook misbehavior, the administrative indifference, the attempts to silence her. She read a letter from a former student whose confidence in education had crumbled after seeing his own legitimate complaints disappear into a void of bureaucratic stonewalling. She concluded with words that throbbed with controlled emotion. Her address was followed by a slow-building standing ovation, swelling as more and more people rose to their feet. Faculty followed, then parents, then students, until it seemed the entire room was applauding, some in solidarity, others perhaps in relief that the hard truth had finally found a voice. The school board, under a microscope they could no longer evade, immediately voted to appoint an entirely independent commission composed of outside educators, legal experts, and community representatives. During that same meeting, Principal Adams was placed on leave pending investigation, and Lori Miller's involvement in unofficial decision-making was referred to the County Ethics Board. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The commission reviewed the evidence. Anonymous witnesses gave testimony under protection. District officials, wary of further scandal, stepped back from direct involvement. Every time there was an attempt to delay or muddy the process, it was met with the glare of public attention and the collective energy of a community determined to see it through. Throughout it all, Emily found herself increasingly surrounded by messages of gratitude from strangers, old friends resurfacing, even cautious words of respect from former doubters. She was not naive. She knew vindication would not erase the wounds. But the knowledge that her struggle had sparked a reckoning brought her a sense of hard-earned peace. And Maplewood began to change. The parents who had once whispered behind closed doors now debated policy in the open. Teachers organized around their collective rights rather than hiding their concerns in the staff lounge. Most importantly, students witnessed, some for the first time, what it meant to challenge injustice with integrity and perseverance. In the quiet after the storm, as the decisive blow landed and the old, rotten foundations finally began to crack, Emily understood she had helped awaken something bigger than herself, a hope, at last, that the truth could prevail. The truth laid bare. The days following the school board's landmark meeting unfolded with an intensity that swept through every corridor of Maplewood High and echoed far beyond its walls. The machinery of inquiry was fully engaged, more public and more accountable than anyone could remember. In classrooms, in administrators' offices, and on the sidewalks out front, there was a kind of charged quiet, anticipation laced with anxiety, relief, and hope. True to its promise, the Independent Investigative Commission moved quickly and thoroughly. Composed of education experts, legal consultants, and respected figures from outside the district, the panel assembled in a borrowed conference room at the town library. It became a hive of activity. Witness after witness, teachers, custodians, parents, students were called in, each bringing a piece of the fractured truth. The commission worked with a steadfast sense of duty, insisting on transparency and holding every interview with both sensitivity and rigor. Emily, summoned as a key witness, spent hours reviewing her files before her scheduled testimony. She walked into the library on that cold December morning with her chin lifted and her evidence tub in tow. Unlike the brittle formality of her earlier district interviews, the mood with the commission was focused but humane. The chair, Dr. Miriam Patel, welcomed her not as a defendant, but as a partner in the search for the truth. Their questions were clear, unhurried, and sharply intelligent. What could she tell them about the administrative decisions disfavoring certain students? Could she elaborate on the mechanisms that allowed complaints to escalate against teachers perceived as difficult? Why had she chosen not to remain silent? Emily described everything in measured detail. The subtle, constant pressure to ease standards for particular families, the veiled threats from parents and administrators, and the sudden escalation from rumor to formal complaint after she refused to falsify a grade. She handed over her charted data, lists of disciplinary actions, irregular student transfers, email chains in which Principal Adams and Mrs. Miller coordinated responses to parent concerns. The committee noted everything, asking factual follow-ups but rarely challenging her integrity. They thanked her sincerely for her courage. Other witnesses, emboldened by the process, stepped forward with corroborating details. Several teachers confirmed that policy decisions were made in back halls or private emails. One admitted shame for years of quiet compliance, but now found the courage to speak. A veteran janitor described how rooms were sometimes assigned or schedule changes made at Mrs. Miller's request, always without the signature of any school employee except the principal. A guidance counselor provided anonymized examples of students who miraculously improved grades or disciplinary records after parental complaints. Meanwhile, Lori Miller, Principal Adams, and a handful of their allies were called in separately. For them, the committee's questioning was more pointed. Presented with documentary evidence, conflicting emails, backdated memos, testimony from multiple witnesses, they issued denials or tried to shift blame. When faced with messages exchanged between Adams and Miller discussing neutralizing Emily, their explanations fell flat. The atmosphere in the commission room, once just charged with hope, now carried the gravity of reckoning. As the investigation progressed, the mood in Maplewood transformed. Where once community forums had been rife with gossip and defensiveness, now there was a sober reckoning with both the facts and the feelings beneath them. Past and present, students used social media, podcasts, and even the local television news to tell their stories, not simply of Emily's case, but about the broader pattern of inequity they'd seen or felt. Formerly silent teachers supported each other more overtly, publicly signing a petition calling for a new code of administrative conduct and more transparent oversight. The commission promised to release its findings at a special town hall meeting ahead of winter break. On the appointed night, the auditorium filled well before the start, with people standing in the back and outside, streaming the event on their phones. Excitement, dread, and anticipation mingled in the air as Dr. Patel took the stage to deliver the summary report. Her speech was unsparing, but never sensational. The room erupted into a mix of applause, gasps, and murmured relief. Some parents wept quietly. A few who had helped fan the rumors about Emily looked ashamed, eyes downcast as the full weight of what had happened became clear. Emily sat in the third row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For weeks, she had dreamed of this vindication, but the reality was overwhelming. The board publicly apologized to her that night, the principal's booming voice uncharacteristically shaky as he read the prepared statement. School officials issued her a formal invitation to return to her position, along with acknowledgement that her reputation and career had been unjustly damaged. For once, there were no hedges or half-truths, only an honest admission of guilt and a pledge to do better. Back at home that evening, Emily sat quietly with a cup of tea, letting the silence fill her apartment. She reread the commission's report until she was sure she had not misunderstood. Messages poured in. Friends, former students, even colleagues who had once kept their distance, now thanking her for her backbone and her faith in what was right. She laid her phone aside, finally allowing herself space to cry, not from grief, but from relief, gratitude, and exhaustion. Her reinstatement, scheduled for the start of the new term, came with new responsibilities and opportunities. She was invited to help reevaluate Maplewood's disciplinary policies, join a teachers' committee on ethics and equity, and speak at statewide symposia for educators about the importance of integrity, fair process, and solidarity among faculty. But beyond all the formal remedies, the most profound shift was in the community itself. The walls of silence that had once protected the privileged few were gone. Conversations about justice, ethical leadership, and equal treatment became common at PTA meetings and in school hallways. Maplewood High embarked on a process of genuine reform, imperfect and sometimes painful, but powered by a spirit of honesty that Emily's ordeal had helped awaken. As winter set in around the small Oregon town, Emily Turner found herself transformed, not untouched by pain, but strengthened by it. She understood her victory was not just personal. It was a gift for all the teachers and students to come, a promise that, in Maplewood at least, the truth could and would prevail. Healing and growth. Returning to Maplewood High after so many months away felt, at first, almost surreal. As Emily Turner stood before the school's familiar brick facade on that chilly January morning, memory and uncertainty tangled in her chest. She ran her hand along the iron railing, cold and solid, grateful for its grounding presence. Through the frosted pane of the lobby doors, she could already see students bustling past, their voices rising and folding in muffled cheer, oblivious, perhaps, to just how much had changed. Inside, colleagues who had once kept a cautious or neutral distance now greeted her with real warmth. Ms. Parker enveloped her in a hug. Mr. Jenkins from math, notorious for avoiding any fuss, shook her hand and murmured, "It's good to have you back, Turner." Administrators introduced her at the morning faculty meeting not as a returning outcast, but as a model of integrity and resilience. When the principal, Maplewood's interim leader, a calm, fair-minded veteran from another district, welcomed Emily, he did so publicly and with open relief. Yet, despite all the community support and careful apologies, the scars ran deeper than most people knew. Emily still found herself tensing whenever she glimpsed a group of parents chatting in the hallway or when a familiar last name landed in her inbox. For a while, anxiety hovered over every coffee break and lesson plan, a silent echo of all that doubt and isolation. Gradually, reality began to soften the edges of her fear. Students, some shy, many openly admiring, left handmade, "Welcome back, Ms. Turner," cards on her desk. A senior who had once avoided eye contact during the worst gossip approached after class and said, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you. We missed you." Even her famously skeptical juniors, who prided themselves on cynicism, paid closer attention. While teaching a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird, Emily spoke, not for the first time, about courage and standing up for what's right. "Doing the right thing isn't easy," she said, her voice calm and sure. "But it's worth it." Her students, seeing their own world reflected in her journey, watched more closely than ever. She noticed change rippling outward, sometimes in the smallest of ways. The faculty lounge, once a place where uneasy silences thickened the air, now buzzed with frank conversation. Teachers who had once spoken in whispers about policy or administrative pressure felt emboldened. The school board, moved by the commission's findings, required regular transparency briefings and invited faculty and even student representation to meetings about discipline and curriculum. The climate of secrecy and favoritism had cracked, replaced by a fragile but unmistakable culture of openness. For many at Maplewood, the most important transformation was subtle. Parents who used to treat teachers as adversaries or as mere service workers, especially those emboldened by privilege, now saw them and their power in a different light. Rather than sending angry emails or demanding special treatment, more parents asked thoughtful questions about their children's progress, genuinely seeking advice. The PTA, once dominated by a small, insular group, restructured to ensure broader, more democratic participation. Emily also poured herself into her new role on the Ethics and Equity Committee. Meeting twice a month after school, she and her colleagues drafted revised codes of conduct, recommended safeguards for reporting grievances, and made sure every teacher, especially newcomers, knew their rights and responsibilities. Emily didn't want revenge or recrimination. She wanted justice, fairness, and a path forward for everyone. Of course, healing wasn't a smooth, linear process. Some wounds still stung. A friend who never reached out, awkward silences from a few staff members who hadn't come around, and the persistent ache of reputational injury. Emily knew better than to expect universal understanding. But the honest conversations, sometimes tearful, sometimes angry, helped everyone acknowledge the pain and damage and let real healing take root. Away from school, Emily focused on repairing the parts of her personal life that had frayed. She returned to journaling in earnest, finding solace in the practiced act of reflection. Some nights, she'd review her emails and messages from supporters, reliving encouragements that had buoyed her during the darkest days. Other evenings, she simply watched the rain slide down her window, breathing in the quiet and letting herself feel pride for having survived the storm. As spring approached, the pace of renewal for Maplewood accelerated. The school invited outside facilitators to lead workshops in restorative justice, anti-bullying, and community building. Students participated in peer-led circles, where they shared their feelings about the events of the past year. Not just about Emily's ordeal, but about all the ways power and silence had warped their experiences. It wasn't easy. Some sessions ended in tears or sharp debate, but students and staff alike felt heard in ways they never had before. Emily especially found meaning in mentoring younger teachers, many of whom had reached out after her public ordeal for guidance. Over coffee or in quiet after-school sessions, she listened to their concerns about difficult parents, heavy workloads, or the burden of living up to standards. She reminded them, gently but firmly, that integrity would always matter more than popularity or comfort. "Teach for the students," she told them, "and for yourself. Everything else is noise." Late evenings sometimes found her back at her computer, responding to journal requests or interview invitations. She spoke to regional education networks about her experiences, always centering her message on collective responsibility and the power of moral courage. She never portrayed herself as a martyr. Instead, she insisted on framing her story as that of a community waking up, together, to its blind spots and possibilities. For Emily personally, growth meant relearning trust in her colleagues, in her profession, and most of all, in herself. She became more forgiving of her vulnerability, recognizing it not as a flaw, but as a vital wellspring of empathy. She left room for joy, coffee dates with friends she'd reclaimed, hikes in the nearby forest preserves, dinner with her mother who had flown in to visit and marvel at her daughter's strength. Every so often, as Emily stood at the back of her classroom watching students gather for homeroom, she'd feel a poignant mix of gratitude and humility. She had weathered the worst that rumor, power, and bureaucracy could throw at her, and emerged not unscathed, but wiser and more deeply committed. She knew her journey was ongoing, that wounds would sometimes reopen and challenges would return, but her sense of purpose had never been clearer. Maplewood, too, was transforming, not into a perfect school, but a real one, where truth mattered more than pretense, where healing came through acknowledgement, action, and hope. In that, Emily found the truest reward, not just in her vindication, but in the community's capacity to change, grow, and keep reaching towards something better, together. An open ending. Winter's final hush had settled over Maplewood, frosting the edges of the school's wrought iron gates and cloaking the town in a quiet, pearly light. Emily Turner walked beneath bare, arching trees on her way up the school steps, feeling the icy air pinch her cheeks and wake her senses. Each day since her return unfolded differently than before. Familiar, yes, but subtly transformed, as though the old school had shed its skin and emerged, tentative yet luminous, into a new chapter of its existence. Emily had learned that victory, in the aftermath of a battle so personal and public, wasn't triumphant or final. It was complex, layered with uncertainty and resolve. Her own scars, bruises of fear, flashes of old anger, unexpected doubts, still lingered, surfacing unexpectedly in quiet moments. But she had also learned that healing could thrive in uncertainty, that the absence of tidy resolution meant there was room for possibility. She now found herself called in directions she had never imagined. Invitations arrived for her to speak at other schools about educator advocacy, the dangers of unchecked privilege, and the profound power of collective action. At her first panel, she sat among women teachers who shared their stories of standing alone against institutional injustice. They spoke into the microphone with trembling voices and fierce eyes, and as Emily shared her own journey, she saw healing ripple out across the room, a recognition that none of them had truly been alone. Back at Maplewood High, the changes that had come in the wake of the truth-telling were not always easy or linear. There were days when resistance flared. A disgruntled parent, wary of losing influence, would grumble in a hallway. A faculty member would slip into old patterns, shying away from confrontation. Yet more often than not, these moments were countered by a new spirit of dialogue. Disagreements didn't instantly solve themselves, but they were voiced, heard, and met with a determination rarely seen before. The school board's inclusion of teachers and students in policy decisions was more than symbolic. It was practiced, debated, improved, and imperfectly lived. Emily took pride not only in her own resilience but in the small, vital signs of progress around her. The junior class organized a Voices of Maplewood project, collecting anonymous stories and artwork about experiences with power and fairness in the school. Teachers across departments began collaborating, creating a peer mentoring group for new hires, passing on hard-won wisdom about boundaries, courage, and compassion. The PTA reformed itself, breaking with old hierarchies to make every family feel welcome. Yet life did not become free from pain. Emily occasionally ran into former friends who had disappeared during the crisis, their smiles tinged with regret or wariness. Sometimes anger threatened to overtake her, a memory of the time lost, relationships strained beyond repair. When that happened, she let herself acknowledge the grief, then turned her attention to the possibilities ahead. After school, Emily poured her time into supporting fellow teachers facing struggles of their own. She hosted informal workshops on documentation, communication with parents, and self-care. She joined forces with educators in neighboring districts, founding a small network committed to faculty rights and equitable practices. Occasionally, she found herself sitting in coffee shops late into the night, counseling a young teacher who'd just been unfairly criticized, or exchanging emails with an advocacy lawyer about new legislation affecting school transparency. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. Local news outlets ran follow-ups on Maplewood's transformation, crediting Emily and those who stood with her for sparking an ongoing conversation about fairness and school culture across the region. Parents expressed gratitude that their concerns could now be aired without fear of backlash or dismissal. Students approached her, sometimes after class, sometimes in written notes left on her desk, confiding in ways she had never experienced before. Even as her profile grew, Emily was deliberate in centering the collective rather than herself. "No one changes a system alone," she told audiences at workshops and panels. "My only strength was the willingness to speak and the trust that others would join me. Change begins when we decide to listen to the quiet voices and include them." She saw how her own story, though unique in detail, was echoed nationwide. Teachers and students everywhere wrestling with the hidden costs of privilege and silence. Outside the school, Emily's life expanded in gentle but important ways. She reconnected with friends from her college years, rekindled her love of hiking in the forested hills around Portland, and invited her mother to visit for a long spring week. In their shared silences, she found new trust and acceptance. Her evenings, once filled with dread and insomnia, now made space for music, books, and the quiet joy of making new plans for the future. The town's journey mirrored her own. Maplewood gradually shed its old reputation for insularity. Community forums grew larger, more diverse, and more honest. Teachers from Maplewood and from neighboring schools took turns organizing open workshops on restorative practices, peer support, and ethical dilemmas in education. The library's meeting room, once home to whispered complaints, became a place of vision building and reconciliation. Of course, there were, and always would be, missteps and setbacks. A proposed policy on handling student complaints drew heated debate and forced the board to amend its language. A rumor once again surfaced about faculty divisions, only to be addressed head-on at a public staff meeting where the principal asked for open discussion and new solutions. Rather than viewing these episodes as failures, Emily and her colleagues learned to treat them as necessary moments of growth, seeing each confrontation as an invitation to keep building trust. Spring brought signs of new beginnings. Emily, as advisor for the Creative Writing Club, helped her students shape an anthology based on themes of courage and truth. Their voices, tentative and bold at once, reflected the full spectrum of the Maplewood experience. Stories about standing up, about forgiving, about seeing and being seen. At the anthology launch, the school auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents, some moved to tears by the honesty on display. Emily herself was changed, not just restored to her old life, but shaped anew by hardship and hope. No longer did she strive for the illusory security of routine. She welcomed the unknown and the chance to keep remaking herself as both teacher and advocate. She understood deeply now that the roots of injustice ran deep, that no single story could change a community overnight, but also that each act of bravery made the next one possible. The end of the school year promised no clear finish line. There would always be another conflict to resolve, another young teacher to support, another policy to refine. But in the pattern of open dialogue, collective effort, and ongoing care, Emily saw hope, an unfinished and unfinishable project that belonged to everyone willing to keep trying. As Maplewood's trees began budding with green and the air filled once again with the sounds of laughter and possibility, Emily paused at her classroom window. She watched the shifting faces of her students and colleagues, understanding that the future was not some distant prize, but a work in progress happening right in front of her eyes. With courage, gratitude, and a steadfast humility, Emily stepped forward to meet whatever and whoever came next.